It was murder. And a murder takes three things: motive, means, and opportunity. And in Jeffrey Epstein's death, we have them all. The list of very powerful people who had reason to silence Jeffrey Epstein is really, really long. Just the number of major banks and their executives who were in some way involved in Epstein's activities is eyebrow-raising. There was Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan, Rothschild's Bank, Barclays. And there were both Democrat and Republican politicians who were implicated in his network. One of them, Stacey Plaskett, the Democratic politician for the U.S. Virgin Islands, had received tens of thousands of dollars in campaign donations from Jeffrey Epstein just weeks before he was jailed. And his social connections were legendary. Donald Trump, Bill and Hillary Clinton, British royalty were at one point all friends of his. However, as soon as he entered prison, one sure way of getting him to flip was for him to start naming people higher up in the chain so he could receive a softer sentence or maybe get out of jail. And this is not to say that any of the people or institution named were involved in his activities or in a homicide. But it is to say that as soon as those prison doors closed on Epstein on July 6, 2019, he had a lot of powerful frenemies. The means for murder. The means were certainly there. Jeffrey Epstein had been placed in America's most corrupt criminal detention center, which is saying a great deal. There were serial sexual abusers, rapists, smugglers, gangsters, drug dealers, and murderers. And those were just some of the prison guards. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown New York, the MCC, was a deliberately maintained prosecution deal factory that punished any professionalism by the guards and tried to break prisoners. There was, quote, a catastrophic camera failure that lasted at least 10 days that most of the guards, and thus criminals, would also know about, leaving an open field for any criminal attempt on Jeffrey Epstein. Now, the opportunity for murder was there as well. And there are two ways that a potential killer could have entered Jeffrey Epstein's cell. First, a hitman could have come in from the outside. Presumably, he would have been dressed as a correctional officer with keys and door passes. Or simply a corrupt prison guard, and there were many of them, could have been paid off to kill him. The second and easiest way was for one of the inmates on his wing of the Special Housing Unit, the SHU, was for him to be paid off to kill Jeffrey Epstein. Now, either way, they had a number of challenges. First was to make the killing look like a suicide. And in the words of the greatest, or arguably the greatest spy master of the 20th century, that's the former head of the Soviet secret services, a guy called Felix Dzerzhinsky, he said, quote, anyone can do a murder, but to make a murder look like a suicide takes an artist, and we have plenty of artists. So, if Jeffrey Epstein was murdered, they, whoever they were, had to make it look enough like a suicide for people to just put it aside as that way. The second challenge was to get on that wing that night. And that seems impossible, that someone from the outside could enter the most secure unit, the SHU, of this detention center. Yes, it was corrupt. Yes, there were criminals among the prison guards. But really, there were so many purported locked doors that it should have been impossible for anyone to enter. But that's exactly what the paperwork done by the MCC Central Command shows. It clearly indicates that there was an extra person on that wing that night. And on the first episode of the Crime Wave series, we've shown that very paperwork done by the MCC that shows that there was an extra person in the SHU that night. And not only that, but they, the Central Command, shows them leaving at exactly 12:35 a.m. that night. And this is big. It's very big. It's undiscussed news by any other outlet that we know of, because that's exactly when Epstein is supposed to have died. Now, the official explanation is that this was a ghost count, a mistake by the prison guards to cover that Jeffrey Epstein's bunkie had left the institution that day. Okay, but Epstein's cellmate had actually left the jail 16 hours before, so why list him at all? And if you just realized in the middle of the night that your most important prisoner in the entire institution is alone in his cell after being placed on suicide watch with explicit instructions never to leave him alone, don't you at least phone the guards to check on him? Nope, not if you work in the MCC. In fact, if you read the explanations of the guards, none of them makes any sense. They say that someone had left the SHU unit. Therefore, their note should read 73, the number of inmates, -1, not +1. It also makes no sense in that the guards on the SHU, like the people who were actually there, faked the count. They actually pled guilty later on to simply signing all their count sheets at the beginning of their shifts and then falling asleep for most of the time. Yet the count sheets at the central command at the MCC changed in the middle of the night. At 10 p.m., they showed that there was an extra person, the +1 figure, and then at 3 a.m., it disappears. So, to sum up, the MCC paperwork indicates that there was an extra person on the SHU at exactly the same time that Epstein's death is presumed to have occurred. That's a really, really strange mistake to make in all the prisons in all of America on that night when the most famous inmate in the country dies. There are purportedly 2 challenges against this paperwork indicating there was an extra person on Jeffrey Epstein's wing that night. The first is that there was one camera in the non-functioning camera system that was supposedly showing all the entries and exits to the unit that night. Now, there are a number of problems with that, with the cameras. One is that we, the public, have not been shown the full unedited camera vision for the entire night. There are a number of minutes missing. And if that's the length of time needed by someone to enter the unit, to have hours of edited video with missing minutes is useless. The other issue is that when CBS News Investigations actually got an expert to examine the released video of the SHU that night, it didn't show what the officials purport that it does, a complete picture of entry and exits to the unit. There were shadow zones on that field of vision that a knowing person, like a guard, could avoid the one camera in the unit from recording them. Another challenge for an outsider is actually the easiest one in a place like the MCC, and that's getting keys to all the doors. Now, putting aside the fact told to us on Crime Waves by one of the former inmates of the MCC that it was not unusual for guards to leave the doors unlocked at night, put that aside. These regular MCC keys were those 20th century old school keys which turn a lock. And those actual metal keys don't record the time or identity of the pass being used to enter the doors. So a corrupt guard could theoretically pass their keys to someone to make that journey into the heart of the SHU without trace. And remember, always, some of the prison guards at the MCC were convicted of schemes as difficult as getting through a few locked doors. They smuggled in drugs, phones, even a gun to prisoners in the SHU. They had forced sex with some of the female inmates. They killed a prisoner. They did all of this, in some cases, for years, and no one saw them do it. So for them to smuggle into the MCC an outsider would have been difficult, but not the impossibility that it might be seen in a well-run prison. For example, the MCC didn't even have the difficulty of being in the countryside, where people approaching the institution are seen driving up. It was on the streets of Lower Manhattan. So somebody could walk up to the delivery door, its main entrance, without suspicion. The final challenge of potentially killing Jeffrey Epstein without waking him up. There were no drugs found in his system that would have made him too sleepy to hear someone entering his cell. Nor was there any sign in his post-mortem medical examination of another person on his fingernails or any sign of a struggle, aside from a very important bruise on his arm. However, he did have headphones on. And when his body was found this next morning, these headphones were still plugged in. And this is a piece of seemingly unexamined evidence. They were plugged into an MP3 device, so he couldn't hear anybody coming in. So a professional killer from the outside, with the help of a corrupt guard inside the MCC's deeply compromised system, could have killed him. A quick karate blow to Epstein's throat as he slept, his hearing blocked by the earphones. Then a series of bed linen torn up to use as a noose to cover up the actual method of killing. The second theory of a potential Jeffrey Epstein murder is simple. It's that someone in the MCC system left two doors open. One a cell door in the L wing of the SHU, the second Epstein's cell door. Again, this is a possibility in almost any other prison in America will be difficult to believe, but in the MCC was deeply corrupt. And the special housing unit was the home of either sex offenders like Epstein, cooperators who had flipped to testify against their former criminal buddies, as many powerful people were afraid that Epstein would do, or the very, very violent, like Epstein's former bunkie, the corrupted cop who was convicted of murdering or ordering the murder of four of his associates. And his method? Strangling them with a plastic zip tie. Now, there's also nothing in Jeffrey Epstein's one post-death medical examination that rules out homicide. In episode 7 of the series, we examine the evidence leading towards a verdict of suicide. And we, on Crime Waves, obtained an undisclosed report by a group of independent coroners who had declared Epstein's death probably a suicide. Now, no one else has seen that report. But when we went in, we showed it to other professionals, and the problem they identified was that it was a group of star-struck medical professionals. None of them had actually examined Jeffrey Epstein's body, and they'd based their opinion not on medical facts, but on, quote, their knowledge of the prison system. And it was also very clear that the pathologists knew who they were examining. They knew in the summer of 2024 that if they were to say that it may have been homicide or even undetermined, it would have fed into a U.S. political electoral frenzy. And at the very least, they knew that the establishment, both political, judicial, and medical, had declared it to be a suicide. So for them, what would be the point of bucking the system? All the medical examiners who authored that report were establishment people. They speak about this, and they say their very credentials made them much less likely to rock the boat of that professional emerger than independently examine the facts. And thus they make much of their collective general knowledge of the state of American prisons. However, judging from their errors in context, they didn't know the specifics of the MCC, the number of to-be convicted murderers, sexual abusers, drug dealers, and smugglers among the prison guards. Now, even with this conventional background, their assessment of the original autopsy is not kind. They pointed out that no one had tested Epstein for some drugs commonly found among criminals, like GBH or Refinol, which is usually known as the date rape drug, which renders their victims unconscious. And this is big. They also found evidence of a potential struggle in the photos of Epstein's body that were not listed in the autopsy notes. For example, they found a, quote, linear lateral contusion on Epstein's left wrist that could be with a tie being placed around his wrist. In fact, they pointed out that there were so many contusions, abrasions, and lacerations on Epstein's body. It was just very odd. It was also odd because that link, that potential injury around the wrist, is a link to an oddly connected murder, very similar to Jeffrey Epstein's death. And I'm bringing it up now because it's at this point in a trial where it's customary for lawyers to not only cast a shadow of doubt on the verdict, but also outline a credible alternative to the theory advanced by their legal opponents. We have one. We have a murder that is so similar to Jeffrey Epstein's in character and connections of the central person involved, in its symbolic showiness, its links to Epstein's social and political circle. Even the medical evidence is breathtaking, if you'll excuse the pun, similar. A case that features lines on the wrists of the victims. And it's a sign of our deeply divided time that seemingly no other media outlet has linked these two possible murders. Here then is that case.